Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights for our lecture featuring esteemed and distinguished Professor Cheryl Cashin of Georgetown Law Center to present her book or provide a book talk on her book, The White Space, Black Hood, Opportunity, Hoarding, and Segregation in the Age of Inequality. And before I introduce our distinguished guest, I want to first encourage everybody to check out the website of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at csrr.rutgers.edu, and to also follow CSRR on Facebook and Twitter at RUCSRR and on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights is the only civil rights center at a law school that focuses on the adverse impact of law and policies the Center for Security, Race, and Rights is the only civil rights center that focuses on law and policies that adversely impact the Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities in the United States through a transnational approach, an interdisciplinary approach, and a cross-racial approach. And as we know right now, these issues are in the headlines, especially when it comes to what is happening in Gaza and what the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, has deemed to be a plausible case of genocide of Israel's assault and mass starvation and bombings of Palestinians in Gaza. And so that is one area in which we focus on, and I would encourage you to see our work on Palestine at csrr.rutgers.edu under resources tab. But we also look at the ways in which racism and systemic racism that affects other minority communities, such as African-American communities, Latinx communities, Asian communities, immigrant communities, and how the roots and origins of those systems and structures of inequality can expand and affect other minority communities. And so today, it is my distinct pleasure to be hosting the leading expert and a thought leader on segregation and inequality, especially as it affects African-American communities, but also other minority communities. Professor Cheryl Cashin is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown University. She teaches constitutional law and race and American law, among other subjects, and is an acclaimed author. She writes about racial justice and democracy, and her most recent book, which we'll be discussing today, is White Space, Black Hood, Opportunity, Hoarding, and Segregation in the Age of Inequality. It is about the role of segregation and redlining in reproducing inequality. Her books have been nominated for the NAACP Image Award for Nonfiction in 2015, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Nonfiction in 2005, 2009, and 2018, and an editor's choice in the New York Times Book Review 2004. Professor Cashin is a former law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and an active member of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council. She has numerous other books, which I highly recommend that you read. And she's also a public intellectual, including being a contributing writer for Politico magazine. And she's also written commentaries for the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Salon, The Root, and other media. And it is also my honor and my privilege to call her a colleague and a friend. So welcome, Professor Cashin, to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. It's our privilege to host you today.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Aziz. I want the audience to know I did not pay Professor Aziz to read that entire bio. I'm delighted to be here, honored to be part of CSSR's series. I'm really humbled to see so many of you willingly spending your Monday afternoon with me. So thank you so much. And I want to say my talk today is about my book because that's what I was invited to talk about. But the last thing I wrote was an MLK Day piece for Politico. And if you Google Cheryl Cashin Politico MLK Day 2024, it's about what I believe were MLK still alive would have to say about the terrible, inhumane attacks on Gazans. So I commend that to you. Dr. King, he gave a speech, an anti-Vietnam speech, and I basically say everything he said about Vietnamese villagers who are being bombed by the US, I think he would say about Gazans. Okay, so solidarity and love to you. I'm going to play a 4-minute film that gives you a very quick overview of this book that I think will make my talk go easier. There'll be a pop quiz afterwards for those of you who suffered through law school. So let's hope technology goes well. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen. And I have my video queued up.
It's destroying opportunity. If high opportunity is sequestered only in certain places, neither cities nor struggling suburbs nor far out rural hamlets are an engine of opportunity in this country anymore. We're not the land of opportunity in this system of residential caste. So I've been a professor at Georgetown Law for 25 years. And I've written a new book, White Space, Blackhood, Opportunity Hoarding and Segregation in the Age of Inequality. And in that book, I'm shining a light on American residential caste. So American residential caste is a system that was intentionally constructed to create affluent white spaces separated and apart from high poverty Black neighborhoods. We overinvest in and exclude in affluent white space, and we disinvest and prey upon the people trapped in the hood. So there are 3 anti-Black processes that undergird residential caste: boundary maintenance, opportunity hoarding, and stereotype-driven surveillance. Boundary maintenance is a polite word for segregation. The most persistent types of neighborhoods in large metropolitan or even medium metropolitan areas is affluent white space and high poverty minority neighborhoods, particularly Black neighborhoods. They have persisted, and the boundaries to those 2 types of neighborhoods have gotten harder. We're more segregated now than we were 20 years ago at these polar extremes. Opportunity hoarding is overinvesting in affluent majority white space and disinvesting elsewhere, particularly in Black neighborhoods. We tend to, use exclusionary zoning, neighborhood assignment, the boundaries of jurisdictions to hoard the opportunities there. Golden infrastructure in schools, wonderful transportation, job-rich social networks. Everyone else who's excluded from those high opportunity environments subsidizes that, right? Through taxation, through gasoline taxes, that gorgeous golden infrastructure is paid for and subsidized by the people who are excluded. And then the third is stereotype-driven surveillance by police and by private citizens. As with slavery and Jim Crow, a lot of non-Black citizens have been conscripted into policing back bodies. Stereotype-driven surveillance is driven by this idea that kind of behavior is deserved in majority Black neighborhoods. Police go through there with a lens, every young man is presumed a thug rather than a citizen. The beauty of, once you understand the processes, they actually provide the way forward. You basically abolish and reverse them. Inclusion rather than exclusion with boundary maintenance, giving historically defunded neighborhoods priority in investing rather than opportunity hoarding and disinvesting in Blackness. Humanization and care rather than stereotype-driven surveillance. A city that's gone through abolition repair, what I imagine and envision is that they will have returned to being engines of opportunity, particularly for poor people in poor neighborhoods. See them as assets and give them a chance to be an agent in their own liberation.
So how's that for optimism? Now, in case you're wondering, my husband and I are art collectors, and I was sitting in our great room, and I'm blessed to be surrounded by art. Okay, so I'm gonna now share my excuse me, PowerPoint slide, I think. Is this it? Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. I'm stealing my own thunder by not having it. Okay. Playing from the start. Okay, so enough about the book. You've heard enough about the book. Let me just say a little bit more. I'm going to walk you very, very quickly through why isn't it working? Okay. So this map of Buffalo gives you an instant a picture of what I mean by residential caste. This is Buffalo. One dot is one person. You see Black people are rendered in green. 85% of Black people live east of Main Street in Buffalo. And there is only one supermarket in East Buffalo, and that because of this extreme hypersegregation, it made it easy for an avowed white supremacist to drive 200 miles from his majority white space to identify the one grocery store where it would be easy to spray down 10 Black people with bullets. And so it is an extreme example, but I show it to you because it would not be possible for millions of individuals just through their individual preferences and where to live to create this extreme degree of racial isolation. And there's no question that many groups in United States history have suffered forms of oppression, from conquest to colonization, exclusion, profiling. It just so happens that this system, residential caste, residential segregation, comes out of a very particular history of anti-Blackness, and that's what I'm talking about today. But I want to underscore that everybody has to live with the advantages and disadvantages of residential caste. For those of you who are watching this from New Jersey, this map is of the Newark area, the Newark metropolitan area, and yellow is Black or African Americans, and you see this density of Blackness again. This was constructed. Each time this country seemed to have put to bed a peculiar Black subordinating institution, it created another one, from slavery to Jim Crow to the iconic Black ghetto. And the rhetoric and mythology and the stereotypes that were part of the politics of creating and supporting these institutions metastasize over time. And I want to underscore, most countries, we have Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, most countries have hierarchies and systems of caste. Ours happens to come out of, and they have an origin mythology supporting it. Ours happens to come out of a long history of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Now, residential caste really arises from the Great Migration. The dominant response to more than 6 million Black people moving between 1910 and 1970 to escape violence-backed Jim Crow to seek opportunity elsewhere in the North, Midwest, and West. The primary response was to contain them in neighborhoods, intensely compact neighborhoods, and to segregate and redline those neighborhoods, could cut them off from the public largesse that was rained down on majority white neighborhoods and exclude them from those neighborhoods and benefits. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the history of redlining that has been covered in many books. Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, covered it. I cover it in Black Space, White Space, Black Hood. This is the Newark area. There was a color code, green being grade A, red being grade D. Most majority Black neighborhoods were marked in red, marked with a D, literally called hazardous. And there's a fed, and if any city you're interested in, if you just Google redlining and the name of the city, the old redlining map will pop up and articles will pop up telling the story of redlining and disinvestment in majority Black and brown, the most politically marginal neighborhoods. And what's sad is that a recent Fed study found that you can go to all of the neighborhoods that were marked with a D in red, and with rare exception, most of those neighborhoods still experience a disinvestment, which began almost immediately, a disinvestment and decline. There's a causal connection decades on. All right, this is more showing of Newark. And it wasn't just redlining. Most of the signature policies of the 20th century that shaped what cities look like and what suburbs look like had an anti-Black element, right? From redlining to single-family exclusionary zoning to urban renewal, mowing down strategically located Black neighborhoods and displacing people who live there, often into public housing assigned on a segregated basis. What happens when you have a policy where 100% of a high-rise public housing is going to be Black and poor? Overnight, you create a density of Black poverty that didn't exist before. And then discriminatory highway construction, where highways were laid intentionally to separate the so-called good and bad sides of town. And stereotypes, there was an iterative relationship. A stereotype would be part of the politics to support an anti-Black systemic law. And those laws, once they created the systems, private individuals that benefited from those systems of exclusion would get inculcated into participating in the politics of maintaining those boundaries. And we've just had an uninterrupted vicious circle like that. And so, here we have an example of from the Philly Camden area. Now, we had a hyper segregation of Black people in the mid 20th century. The good news is that Black-white segregation has been coming down slowly over time, although the vast majority of Black people still experience segregation. It's just not quite as extreme. But the footprint of concentrated poverty of all colors has exploded since in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and you see that here. I don't know what it's like to live in a neighborhood where 80 to 100% of the people around you are poor, but you see the footprint of concentrated poverty has exploded in and around central city of Philadelphia. And then right here, what we're seeing with the gentrification of downtowns is the whitening of strategic areas and becoming more affluent and more white. And this is what residential caste looks like. Now, and a key point, if you remember nothing else I've said today, and Professor Aziz, please give me a 5-minute warning when I'm getting close to running out of my time. But if you remember nothing else I said today, I want you to understand the linkage between the same policies that encourage and construct affluent majority white space also concentrate Black and brown poverty elsewhere. These two ideas are linked. And in many ways, society is increasingly designed for the affluent people that can afford to buy their way into poverty-free Black space. I mean, poverty-free majority white space. And everybody else who can't afford to buy their way in, which often costs like 7 figures, gets a very different deal and is cross-subsidizing through their tax dollars the affluent majority white bubbles. As I said in the film, we tend to overinvest and exclude in affluent space and disinvest and prey on people in areas of concentrated poverty. And what I was showing is that I've given you the history that constructed these boundaries, but I really try to underscore in my book is that the past is not past. We have 3 current ongoing anti-Black policies. And when I say anti-Black, is that it's been shown that the more segregated metropolitan areas, they tend to show higher degrees of anti-Black prejudice in polling. That coupled with exclusionary zoning, many metropolitan cities are zoned such that it's illegal to build anything other than a single family house on as much as 75% of the land, right? That policy is born of anti-Blackness, but every millennial, every color that can't afford a single family house lives with that burden. And increasingly, American households are not 2 parents with children. They're very different. And the market is not building the kind of housing that all kinds of people need because of this system. Opportunity hoarding. So this kind of concentrated poverty, this is hyper-segregated Baltimore. At one point, we had more than 50 cities that were hyper-segregated. Now we're down to about 21. That said, and African Americans are the only racial group in the 20th century that suffered this degree of extreme residential isolation. But it's a good news that we're down to 21 hyper-segregated cities, and Philly Camden is one of them, one of the areas, as is Baltimore, as is Buffalo. But still, we have very high degrees of segregation. And as Douglas Massey says in a very important book called Categorically Unequal, the social distinctions that come naturally to people become much more efficient when they're overlaid with geography. It's much easier to other somebody when you live apart from them and it's those people over there. And when you have decades of disinvestment in majority Black and brown neighborhoods, what people tend to do is associate what those neighborhoods look like with the individuals there. And so we have a rhetoric and a mythology, I call it ghetto mythology, where we pathologize the, I lovingly call the people trapped in high poverty neighborhoods descendants. They are the true descendants of African American slavery, right? We pathologize them, and that mythology, welfare queen, thug, actually helps mask decades of overinvestment in affluent white space and disinvestment there. And I'll tell you, this segregation alters race relations in this way, and particularly creates fear of Black people in large numbers, but it also alters politics such that you have a direct horizontal competition between communities of abundance and great political influence with communities of great need for limited public and private resources, and over again, affluent places win. Even in a majority Black run city where Blacks have majority representation on the city council in Baltimore and have had a series of Black mayors, one scholar looked at the numbers and discovered that Baltimore was spending 4 times as much money for community development and the things that make communities nice in majority white areas than Black areas, to their own horror. And now they're trying to disrupt those practices. In the chapter 1 of the book, I feature Baltimore as a case study, and I particularly focus on a notorious example of opportunity hoarding. Since 1965, there had been a plan on the books to build a light rail line, a subway line that would connect the poorest Black neighborhoods of East and West Baltimore to suburban job centers and to downtown. And thanks to a START grant, a $900 million START grant from the Obama administration, and frankly, their Black Secretary of Transportation, that plus a politics, a democratic multiracial politics that finally supported allocating state funds for this, it was finally going to get built, and you know, a $2 billion project. And what happened? A Republican, Larry Hogan, got elected, and immediately, and it was right after the uprising surrounding Freddie Gray's death, he rescinded the deal and reallocated 100% of the funds that Maryland had allocated to get started on the Red Line, returned the $900 million grant, and reallocated 100% of those funds to road projects in outlying majority white areas. Not even a pothole in Baltimore was filled, right? But he allowed the Purple Line that was going to connect the affluent suburb Baltimore, the affluent Maryland suburbs to the DC metro, right? And he called the Red Line a wasteful boondoggle, despite the fact that all of the people along this line were very dependent on public transportation, and it could take 2 hours to get there, right? So this is opportunity hoarding and the devaluing of the infrastructure and community development needs of Black and brown citizens. It's pretty repugnant. All right. A contrast, Medellin, Colombia. Medellin transformed itself over 2 decades from being one of the most dangerous cities on earth to a beacon of innovation. How did they do it? They prioritized investment in the poorest communities. Planners intentionally connected metro cable cars to the most crime-ridden mountaintop barrios, cutting the commute times from 2.5 hours to 30 minutes, where you could get downtown. Surprise, surprise, homicides in those neighborhoods dropped significantly, and the poverty rate in those neighborhoods dropped by almost half, just from that innovation. But they also went further, and this is an example, I think, of that gives you a sense of what abolition democracy looks like. I'll define that in a minute. But they also invested in new social institutions, created something I'd never heard of, a library park, right? Library parks located in the poorest neighborhoods, where you had a library, but parks and recreation too, where citizens and kids had access to the type of amenities that are very common in affluent private schools: libraries, sports and recreation, computer and internet access, opportunities to produce theater and stage, things that raise self-esteem. They created new citizen centers in the same impoverished hoods that enabled people to access all of the social services and literacy programs. And these neighborhoods were reclaimed from narco guerrillas and became engines of opportunities rather than engines of death. And the entire city benefited, the entire economy. And now people visit Medellin from around the world to try to replicate this. So here's my point. These are just maps showing that back in the US, we still have this pattern of majority white space and concentrated poverty, in part because of intentional strategies about where low-income housing and public housing gets located. This is Houston. This is another map similar to the map I showed you of Philly and Camden. Look how much red is very low income, blue is very high income. Look how much Chicago has just become a city of concentrated wealth and concentrated poverty. There's, you know, the middle class has basically been pushed out of the city. But what happens? You know, the majority white affluent space gets 3 times the public and private investment of vast swaths of poor neighborhoods. You know, they get waves of school closures and disinvestment. All right. So the beauty, as I said in the film, and I'm closing now, is that once you understand these processes and see how damaging they are to the whole, it frees you up to try something different. And the first step, you know, my final chapter is called Abolition and Repair. You know, I argue, we abolish slavery. I argue that we need to abolish residential caste. The first step to abolition and repair is altering the lens, just like in the Medellin example, changing the lens that we apply to poor people in concentrated poverty, from presumed thug to presumed citizen. And once you change, if you apply a lens of care and see these folks as assets, it frees you up to focus on evidence-based strategies that actually have been shown to produce better results, right? It alters the politics and creates possibilities for a new multiracial politics that invests in things that can make lives better, right? And so I'll leave you with some hope, and I'll stop sharing. I hope to leave you with some hope that cities like Newark, and I can give you examples, have actually been trying things based on this lens of care, where they've reduced violence through social experience, like universal basic income or deconcentrating poverty. Some cities have made their bus routes from the poorest neighborhoods free. Some cities have been reversing or repealing their single family zoning code. And I'll end with this point, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, in his masterful book, Black Reconstruction, talked about how we need abolition democracy, that Black Americans will never be accorded the same economic, political, social freedom as whites without a reconstructed society with new institutions, practices, and social relations. And I think the Medellin example shows that. I think our best chance of that kind of coalition politics that makes things better for everyone is in progressive cities, particularly progressive cities that have at least a cooperative state government and not a hostile one. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Cashin. So much to think about. I read your book a year ago, and I thought to myself, the more things change, the more things stay the same. They just take different forms. And I think that is one of the lessons that perhaps many of us as professors try to warn our students is, you read about these systems and structures of inequality 50, 60, 70 years ago, and you'd like to think that it's over. But in fact, it's just been reshaped and repackaged and given a different name and gone from de jure to de facto. So while we wait for folks online to put their questions in the Q&A function, I thought I'd take the moderator's prerogative to ask you a few questions. and you kind of ended with one of the questions that I'm sure many people, when they hear your presentation, it prompts them to think, which is this overlap or this intersection between race and class. And that often also triggers various conversations, and sometimes contentious ones, about, do you focus more on classism or do you focus more on racism, or how do you address them intersectionally when you are trying to create a more equitable society, especially along racial lines. And so when you, in your research, how does someone, whether it's a lawyer, a law student, or a policymaker, whose objective is to ensure that our society, the race you're born with does not determine the class and your economic opportunities, your educational opportunities, or in your life, right? So how you are born is not how you will die, especially in terms of class, but how that then is impacted by race. And how do you kind of wrestle with that, and how do you approach this race class conversation, whether it's through an intersectional or separated approach? But you can't, obviously, just everything you just explained to us in the contemporary era is all about low income, right? And the question is, why are all the low income? Huh?
Let me answer the question, Professor.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. In post-civil rights America, I think we need a more complicated way of thinking about this. Okay. So what I took 200 pages to explain to people that we have a caste system that's at the intersection of where you live, your socioeconomic status, and your race, right? Race alone is not, I mean, yes, my kids, my husband and I, me and my husband have 3 degrees between us, and we're doing economically quite well. But yes, my husband can possibly be profiled if he goes in a store, or people cross the street when they see him, right? But we have access to opportunity, and we have the wherewithal, at least, to negotiate the anti-discrimination laws if a appraiser comes in. I mean, we know, take down your Black pictures, take down your Black art, and we can at least protect ourselves against that kind of stuff, right? But people who are in the most marginal neighborhoods are so othered, and often they're othered by people of their own race, right? So I offered a different vocabulary for thinking about this. And people always want to just go right back to what I'm saying is, we need to disrupt these practices, particularly practices of boundary maintenance. And I argue that when it comes to spending, public spending, that we ought to prioritize and put the people who are at the bottom of this caste system first in line, right? DC is just doing this, right? People from the most marginal neighborhoods get priority in the school lottery for access to the charter schools, which are all over the city, right? People who are in the most marginal neighborhoods should get to ride the metro for free, right? We need to help them access opportunity, right? Their neighborhood should be first in line for parks and recreation because they've been, I almost used the vulgarity, but they've been so disinvested in, right? So I guess because of 2 decades of obsession with this, I've been thinking about place and where you live. And it's also a way of creating some solidarity. Concentrated poverty is growing fastest in the suburbs. Some of these older first string suburbs that used to be the Levitt towns of opportunity now are just like overrun by poverty, right? And people of a lot of different colors are stuck in these communities. So I'm not saying race and class don't matter, but what I'm trying to get people to think about is systems, right? With race and class, people tend to revert to the anti-discrimination model and how you protect individuals. I'm trying to get people to think about systems and policies that systemically box a lot of people out. I hope that's helpful.
No, that's very helpful. And it sounds like the key players are the mayors and the urban planners and cities, and maybe to a lesser extent, but equally important, are state legislators. Because, one of the challenges, as somebody who doesn't study local and state law and politics, it's always, you're trying to figure out who's your target audience that has the most influence. And one of the things you mentioned, which I thought was telling, and I certainly have been thinking about it quite a bit because of the case of Baltimore and Newark and DC, is what is your advice, if we were to say in the abstract, right, to mayors who are Black and who have large areas of concentrated poverty that also happen to be primarily Black neighborhoods? And they're
That's the case in all three of the cities you mentioned, isn't it?
Right, exactly. And so for those who have not yet had a chance to read your book, and hopefully this will prompt them to do this talk, is what is the type of advice that you give them, or policy recommendations you give them, that you find to be the most impactful in terms of the types of changes?
Okay, well, more than 24 mayors of all colors have adopted or are trying to adopt universal basic income pilots, where they can't afford to do it for everyone, but they're trying this, where they surprise, surprise, you give a impoverished family $500 a month unconditional. They spend it on the things that really help their children, and they do so much better. The children do better. They don't end up in the criminal justice system. So there's an example. So UBI experience for communities. And DC is definitely, fortunately, nationally, the violent crime is going down, but not in DC. We just had a shooting right on the corner, a block and a half from my house, on Thursday night, right? This is really real in this city. I hold up the example. I think prioritizing violence reduction in innovative ways should be a #1 priority of every mayor, right? Violence, it affects everybody, right? And I give this example. It's just innovation of the first city that got going on this, Richmond. Richmond had one of the worst homicide rates per capita in the country, Richmond, California. And this person who looked at it was basically only 24 young people, the 24 young people who were most likely to pull the trigger, with a lens of care. He could see himself in them. And they came up with this innovation. They knew exactly who they were, went to them and said, what do you need to turn your life around? Do you need to get out of this neighborhood? Do you need a driver's license? Do you need cognitive behavior therapy? They just wrapped them in unconditional love, and got $1 million grant, seed money from the city, but also from philanthropists, and created urban peacemaker fellowships, where if they developed a life plan, they had 24/7 a life plan for each of them to turn their lives around. And if they stuck with it for 9 months, they started paying them $1,000 a month stipend just to be nonviolent. And the people who were most expert on violence in that city were the people most likely to pull the trigger. And they saw them as an asset. They know more than anybody what's causing the violence and how to turn it around. So when the people most likely to shoot started changing their lives, it had multiplier effects. Violence went down in that city by more than 50%. And then, of course, the city starts gentrifying, so people start moving in, right? But I would encourage every mayor who's got violent neighborhoods, and a lot of large urban cities do, to just look at these models, or how we can create a transcending scenario with some serious results quickly. And I offer up, so in terms of infrastructure, in terms of anti-violence, in terms of individual support, I'm a big fan of UBIs, I'm a big fan of the model of Medellin. Transportation, it could take decades to change residential patterns, but transportations connect people to opportunity immediately, right? Make bus routes free for people from the poorest neighborhoods. You could figure that the multiplier effects of helping people get jobs and start paying taxes are tremendous. I hope this is helpful.
Yeah, and sadly, it is often these wealthy neighborhoods who again are predominantly white that don't want the public transportation because they don't want the minorities to, or the low income communities of whatever race, to have access, physical access to their spaces. So I know, you know, myself from personal experience in the town that I live in Westfield, New Jersey, it's just remarkable how this aversion to poverty and racial minorities is so palpable, even if it's not explicitly spoken. And you feel like you're back in the 1950s.
Right, right. And so, you know, we need to have some successes to turn this around. I mean, the if you can get violence down, it helps a lot. Violence is a big thing that animates fear. But the thing that gives me hope is each new cohort of young people in this country is more diverse than the one that preceded it. And I think the younger you are, the more openness you have to entering very diverse, economically and racially very diverse space, particularly if it's more affordable, right? And so I think it's easier to create a multiracial democracy in which inclusion is valued with new generations of younger people. And I give the example of Louisville, Kentucky, which went from hyper segregated to just segregated, and has a real culture of people valuing public schools and integrated public schools. They have a voluntary integration system that's based on neighborhoods and where you live, not race, because the Supreme Court won't let you consider race. But when they decoupled access to really good schools from where you live, suddenly you could take the risk of buying a cheaper home in a more poor or marginal neighborhood, and younger people, younger whites who can't afford these and don't want these big suburban mansions, started buying, you know, and buying that model. And so that over 2 decades, the housing market became less segregated and it's not hyper segregated. So, you know, I don't know that I can expect older people to change their ways, but anyway.
Well, before I move to the audience questions, I just want to put a pitch in and a shout out, frankly, and to the Chancellor of Rutgers Newark, Nancy Cantor, who has done a remarkable job of trying to integrate many of the concepts and ideas that your book discusses, as well as our mutual colleague David Trout, who I'm proud to have as name as my colleague at Rutgers Law School, who also
my classmate, my soul
yes.
brother,
who also works on metropolitan inequality and race, and this concept of an anchor institution within universities that don't just kind of take resources but don't give back, and also are in cities such as Newark, where you do have concentrated poverty and hyper segregation, and it is in fact along racial lines, but they don't enroll the residents of the very cities that they live in. And I think that universities play a really important role. So I'm proud that Rutgers Newark does it, and I'm also extremely proud of our minority student program at Rutgers Law School, which was, I think, the first in the country back in the late 60s, early 70s. So we have a question here from one of our bright law students, and I'll just read it and then let you answer it. So in a society where we place such high value on commercial activity, we prioritize the economic benefit people can bring to society rather than viewing it the other way around. In inner cities, many of us feel inundated with the sweeping quote unquote reform that deprioritizes generations of Black and brown residents in favor of those who have recently migrated. who typically are white or foreign nationals and tend to be of a higher class status. This leads to less public transportation, less parking, reduced spending on social services, and less equitable housing programs, etc. Do you have suggestions from what your research has shown you about spaces like Medellin, for example, for organizers who want to persuade local governments to reconsider its current practices? And this comes from a Jersey City resident.
My mother was born and raised in Jersey City. I used to get shipped up to see my grandmother in Jersey City. So thank you for that question. Very bright law student and Jersey City resident. And it's spot on. Okay. Everything you say, I concur. That's part of what I talk about with opportunity hoarding. Cities tend to value non-Black people or ignore longtime Black residents and their aspirations, the things they want to make their lives good, right? And there's like competition. What affluent people, particularly affluent whites who move into areas, tend to succeed in bending development patterns to their will and what they want, luxury downtown development, a sports stadium to go watch baseball, connecting, their neighborhood to the airport, things like this, right? And these are like the most advantaged people, right? And what I try to show is if you look at the economics of that, it tends to not really have multiplier effects in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, while cities were gentrifying it, spaces were getting wider in the downtown, most Black neighborhoods were getting worse off. So you're exactly right. What's the answer? Black people, and all people, one thing I want to make clear is it's only about, I would say about maybe 20% of the population in any given city, and probably less than that, really benefits from this luxury development that meets their needs. And everybody else is not really getting, so grassroots organizations, I used to be part of Building One New Jersey, but what they would do is have workshops to teach people how to do the grassroots organizing, where they would get the indigenous leadership in Black and Latino communities to learn how to build alliances for strategic things with, people who also were representing marginalized whites. Now, it could be in a particular city that just organizing well Black and brown people who are getting disinvested in, and getting them to show up at the hearings, and just show the numbers and say, we're not getting our fair share. I feature some examples of that, right? We need to deprogram. We need to take some of this police money and put it into some of these kinds of strategies I've talked about. So at minimum, the Black community that's historically disinvested, you have to organize. And but it's better to organize around a particular campaign. We want the red line, or we want X. I give an example in Milwaukee. A Black-led organization had their own planning exercise where they talked to people in these neighborhoods and says, what do you need? What kind of investment? And they came up with their own suggested budget and lobbied the city council and said, we've identified funds in the police department. And we think, and they actually succeeded in getting them to reallocate some funds from the police budget. Milwaukee was spending half its budget on policing, right? And they got reallocated, and one of their number one priorities was summer jobs for kids, right? So the brass tacks of organizing and actually engaging people in understanding budgets and visualizing what they need in their communities, and learning how to get in the faces of councilmen and mayors and demand what you want is really critical.
Great. So another question is, as we think about repair and the ongoing legacies of Jim Crow, what does a framework for reparations look like? What kinds of tools are available in your mind between payment to direct descendants of slaves or broader pro-urban policies that repair broken transportation networks and zoning codes? Would you describe these pro-urban policies as reparations or as something else?
So I decided when I was writing that final chapter, which I do commend to you, and if you want a short free version of it, you can Google Cheryl Cashin Politico residential caste, and you'll find a 3,000 word piece in which I talk about this. I decided to use the term repair, abolition and repair, rather than reparations. Why? Because I came to the conclusion that even if we succeeded in getting a program of reparations in which checks were cut to people, and the city of Evanston got a housing reparations program. If we didn't disrupt these practices that maintain residential caste, decades would go by and we'd still have the same problems, right? So I decided to focus on identifying and saying we must disrupt and reverse these practices, and the areas of the city that were historically redlined and are still disinvested, they should be put first, right? And the descendants who live in those communities should be engaged in identifying the priorities for them and what they think. And rather than me be prescriptive and say, cut these people checks, right? And doing that hard work, it is necessary to engage citizens in their neighborhoods and give them a process by which they acquire power and agency and voice. Those are part of the process of fixing a politics in which they have no voice. And if you skip over that and just talk, first of all, I actually think if you just lead with reparations, people just think about reparations for slavery and cutting checks. And for many people, it's a non-starter. That's the main reason I went toward repair, is because I really think democracy itself needs to be repaired to change the caste system we have. And I prefer to also keep the land. I think that the reparations is most associated with compensating for a legacy of slavery. And I think it's perhaps better to just keep that language for that. And my book is not about that. It's about residential caste and disrupting it.
Right. So we have another question here, which is, you mentioned these initiatives on reshaping progressive metropolitan areas within states with hostile state governments being more difficult. Do you have suggestions on what can be done, or where progressive cities within hostile state governments can begin to reshape their cities like Memphis, for example?
Oh, Lord. I went to undergrad in Tennessee. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama. I went to undergrad at Vanderbilt, and I'm very aware of, as is everybody, watch the news, of just the sheer hostility in the Tennessee legislature, right? And the idea that you can't even get through common sense gun laws when white Christian children, at a white Christian institute, majority white Christian institution, get mowed down, and Republican white women are saying, "Why won't you listen to me?" Right? It's really, really hard. I will say though, whatever, and I have no familiarity with Memphis's budget, right? But whatever Memphis's resources are, my hope is that they at least have control over how they spend their resources, and spending it equitably and creating a politics to support historically disinvested neighborhoods and disinvested people ought to be doable through organizing whatever the funding they do have. right? And there's actually, Professor Aziz talked about, well, I want to make this clear. This is not just a story of municipal government, right? There's a long story of the federal government and their policies encouraging and supporting this residential caste, right? But the Biden administration and the Obama administration have tried to do things differently, and there's like a lot of infrastructure dollars available. So and some thoughtful people at HUD, at Commerce, that might join hands with and help folks in Memphis to figure out how to get access to some of this money.
Yeah, no, it's a lot. It's arguably harder to implement the brilliant strategies that we come up with as academics than it is to come up with the actual strategies based on the research. But yes, it's implementation is a challenge. All right, so one of the I'll end with a question that is about the rural areas. So you mentioned that these processes of racially based spatial underbounding, excuse me, happen in urban, suburban, and rural areas. How does the process work in rural areas and communities?
Okay, so this is an area of weakness in my research, and I don't have expertise. I'm going to be honest. I do not have any expertise in the rural context. What I can say, based on my experiences is living in Alabama and being very aware of, the Black Belt of Alabama, the places where the plantation economy, it's a part of the state that had the rich, dark soil that's called the Black Belt. The plantation economy reigned supreme. For Black people in the rural South, particularly, there's a legacy there of historically impoverished Black areas. They don't have the same legacy of redlining necessarily, but they do have this experience of disinvestment. There's a whole story. I've written a little bit about it, about Black farmers and long experience of Black farmers being discriminated against in their access to financing through the agriculture department. But I do not have knowledge or expertise about the patterns and all of that. And I'm just going to acknowledge that. My book is mainly about metropolitan areas and how residential caste was constructed and maintained. And I'm sorry.
Maybe the person who asked the question can write that book. Do that in-depth research on rural areas. But I think it's important that we acknowledge, right, the differences between the urban experience, suburban, and the rural area. So I will end then with one more question. As surveillance and terror policies evolve, what can advocates keep in perspective, especially when it comes to narratives about crime and justice and the stereotyping?
Repeat the question. I'm trying to get the essence of the question.
So as surveillance and terror policies evolve, what can advocates keep in perspective when it comes to narratives about crime and justice? And so you talked about
surveillance and terror policies. Is that what you said? Okay,
yes.
Okay.
Or I think they might mean national security policies.
Right.
Or
Okay.
police violence, which some people call terroristic.
Okay, no, it's helpful. So one thing I underscore about all surveillance strategies or all othering policies, there's typically a nasty othering of a group to justify what police or law enforcement do. We have, thug and the racing of Black men as violent thugs, right? That justify super predators. You've heard it all, right? And then particularly after 9/11, as you know, right? You had the racing of people who, my one foray in there, you had me come to something a long time ago. This is how we met, right? I wrote one piece about how people who were Muslim or appeared by ignorant people to be Muslim, how they were raced, right? So one thing is to just expose, and interrogate and that this the lies that are told about groups and how they're raced, to justify this and expose it and answer it, with data. But also, unfortunately, it's not data or truth that matters in America. It's who wins the narrative. So you need to have a counter narrative. And it's a war of narratives, but showing that often these narratives lead to decisions that don't even help the US. I mean, like, look at what's happened in Gaza, right? It's not in Joe Biden's interest what he's done. It's not in his interest politically. It's not even in Israel's interest what they've done, right? The way in which Palestinians and Gazans have been like raced, and so I mean, our only hope is for people to be willing to stand up and expose these narratives and lies for what they are, and say, this is causing us to adopt policies that don't even solve the underlying alleged national security problems. But meanwhile, when you see people see the situation clearly, this is what should happen. I hope that's helpful. I'm by no means an expert in the area of surveillance.
I think it is helpful because it's important for people to recognize that narratives, stereotypes, social psychology, politics is equally important as law, and especially since this is a law school center, and we need to. It's not enough, right, just to write a good law or what one believes is a quote unquote good law, but it's also how it interplays with politics. And so I want to just thank you so much, Professor Cashin, for taking time out of your very busy schedule to enlighten us and to inspire us. If folks in the audience haven't read her book, I highly, highly recommend it. White Space, Black Hood, Opportunity, Hoarding and Segregation in the Age of Inequality. The amount of facts and data that you provide is just, it's so persuasive, especially when couched with the bigger picture and the history. So thank you for writing it. And thank you for giving us kind of an abbreviated version today. And thank you for everyone in the audience for being here for our lecture series, Humanizing the Other. We have 2 more in the Center for Security, Race and Rights lecture series coming up. Noura Erakat will be speaking on February 21st. So please register for that online. And we also have Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, who will also be speaking on March 6th. And just to finalize with a pitch for the Center for Security, Race and Rights is the first and only civil rights center that focuses on law and human rights and public policy that disparately affect Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. Please follow us on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR, on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And this excellent presentation will also be joining our previous lectures from our lecture series. So with that, thank you again, Professor Cashin, and thank you everyone for attending this informative and inspiring talk.
Thank you. Lovely to be with you all.
Masalam.